Warnings, I will mention like transphobia and homophobia a bit in this talk. So yeah, hi guys, I'm Noor, and first of all, thank you so much for having me. So first, just a little about me, and specifically my connections to PAC and the Asian American community at Northeastern. Right now, I'm a co-head in the Asian Student Union Minis program, and I'm also a mentor in Asian American Students in Action, or as a lot of you know, Asia, and I was actually Claire's mentee in that same program last year. Both years I was in Asia, I was one of 3 South Asian people total in the entire club. So I grew up in New Jersey, but rural, backwoods, almost in Pennsylvania, the town of Flemington, New Jersey. My high school was about 85% white, and so I automatically became close with the only other people of color there, creating a tight-knit group that, to this day, are still some of my best friends. High school was also where I first realized I was queer, too, when I was about 14 years old. But for the most part, I hid that part of me away. I didn't think Flemington, New Jersey could handle that, but more importantly, I don't think the person I was in high school could have truly comprehended my own identity. Even today, I am still coming to terms with myself, and I'm constantly gaining new insight about what it truly means to be me. Coming to Boston last September, I was ecstatic to find out that thankfully, the entire world was nowhere near as sheltered as Flemington. With this in mind, I began to become the person I always wanted to be. Those of you who knew me last year can attest to this, but I spent the first year of college cutting my hair shorter and shorter. I finally used the name I wanted to. I realized that organizations like the AAC actually exist here, and that people actually joined them and participated in events. I was convinced that this was it. This was where I belonged, and my college experience was going to be the opposite of everything I'd struggled with in high school. My search was finally over. I was Noor, I was openly queer, and I was Indian American. But realizing these things independently was far from the end of my journey to find myself. Slowly but surely, a few things I had never considered before became clear. First, the realization that I am always going to be a person of color before I'm queer. And secondly, I am always going to be South Asian before I'm Asian. So what does this mean in terms of how I'm perceived? And how do other people's perceptions of me match who I actually am? Are they really seeing me? I came to college with the goal of finally being my most authentic self, consistently, now that I didn't have to worry about the constraints of my family and my hometown. But what did that actually mean? I started to realize that in presenting more visibly queer, there was a voice in my head telling me that I was assimilating too much, becoming too white, and that this rejection of my hometown's cis-normative expectations inherently meant a rejection of my identity as South Asian. This is probably because my immigrant parents automatically associate anything LGBT-related with Western ideology. When I first tried to come out to them when I was about 15, I was told that being gay is an American thing. It's for white people, not us. After that, I stopped looking for approval from my family, and instead tried to find queer-friendly spaces in my community. But what I found only seemed to reaffirm my parents' mentality. There were no people of color in my high school, let alone in their LGBT organizations. And this feeling of ostracization was further amplified from another perspective when, in trying to join Asian American organizations at Northeastern, I was constantly one of the only Indian American people, and most of the conversations that happened surrounded East Asian issues, norms, and ideals. Despite attempts made to try and relate to them, I couldn't help but always feel a bit out of place, like I didn't truly have a voice in these groups. There were countless awkward moments last year during discussions where I felt as though I was on the outside, and that everybody could relate to what was being talked about except for me. Despite these organizations supposedly being meant for the entire Asian American community, I felt as though it was wrong for me to be there. I remember vividly at one of the info sessions for Asia this year, back in September, I had a freshman who was Indian American come up to me, and I'd come to this a little bit late, and she told me she was so glad to see me because before I'd gotten there, she didn't think that Asia was even open to South Asian applicants. Beyond that, conversations about queer issues happened once as a theme for a biweekly in Asia, and then never again. My college expectations were a little crushed as I felt as though I didn't belong in these so-called safe spaces that were supposedly made for me, but only ever one part of me. And this inherent feeling of not belonging made me question myself. If I was comprised of all these contradictions, how could my identity possibly be valid? It wasn't until just last March, about 6 years after I first started to consider the idea that I was gay, in a lecture for one of my courses last semester, Colonialism and Imperialism, that a reading sparked my interest, and I fell down a rabbit hole of finally researching South Asian history and traditional Hinduism. I found out that a third gender actually exists in Hinduism, and there are certain states in northern India that allow people to select a third option outside of male or female for their official ID. This was especially surprising considering the fact that my very traditional, very Hindu family had never once thought to mention this. I had grown up with these principles, and I had learned that the best strategy always was to compartmentalize. There was Indian Noor who went to the Mandir every month and visited Mumbai in the summer. And then somewhere else, on another plane of existence, there was non-binary Noor who got a half shave 2 weeks into college and who my parents had no idea existed. But based on that initial reading I did in colonialism and imperialism, I think my family's perspective was definitely owed to their own assimilation. The fact that Western ideas of cisgender and heteronormativity had somehow become the norm, and simultaneously, deviation from that norm was also associated automatically with Eurocentrism. It was both fascinating and disheartening to realize that things had not always been this way, and I was determined to learn more. From there, I continued to find people who understood in surprising places. Despite feeling out of place in Asia and ASU initially, since getting to know my fam and my ASU Minis better, I have since realized that the community I had always had in mind coming to college had always been there. I just had to find it. Long conversations followed about societal expectations and gender and queerness and ethnicity, and how I could not possibly be this anomaly I had made myself out to be, when there were other people who had been through exactly what I had. This semester, I'm fortunate enough to be taking Introduction to Transgender Studies. I think this is the first semester it has ever been offered at Northeastern. Well, at the beginning of the year, it definitely felt a little bit like my high school GSA. As I actually delved into the academic side of queer studies for the first time, I was able to see myself entirely in a new way. Yes, I'm a person of color before I'm a lesbian, and before I'm non-binary. But I realized that this is merely in terms of perception, not actuality. Yes, you can tell one much more easily than you can tell the other. But in reality, I am both, and neither detracts from the other. So during ASIA's first bi-weekly this year, one of the activities we did, I think it was called like Step Into My Shoes or something similar. Basically, at the retreat a few weeks earlier, we had all anonymously filled out forms checking different boxes about ourselves if certain statements applied to us. Statements such as, I feel as though I belong at Northeastern. I have felt out of place due to my ethnicity. I have been the only person of my race in the room. We all handed in our papers, and then they were shuffled and handed out again. So we had somebody else's, only we had no idea whose since you weren't allowed to put your name on the paper. Then we all stood in a circle, and the co-chairs alternated reading the statements out loud. And if the box on the paper you were holding was checked, you stepped forward. One of the questions was about gender identity. I think it was just something along the lines of, I have questioned my gender identity. As far as I'd known, at that point, at that bi-weekly, I was the only openly trans person in Asia. But the fact that there were multiple people who stepped forward for that question spoke volumes. That was one of multiple moments in this past year that I've actually truly realized that I am not alone. And that's why conversations like this are so important. So I wanted to bring some of the things I've learned in my trans studies class to light, mostly for the people out there who did check that box, because you are not an anomaly or a contradiction. Emi Koyama is one of the scholars we studied. She's a grassroots activist, author, and academic who specifically writes and researches gender and intersex issues alongside anti-racism. One of the most eye-opening pieces of literature I have ever read, academic or otherwise, is her article titled Whose Feminism Is It Anyway?, which we read in class while studying transgender inclusive feminism, but upon closer reading, I realized applied to intersectionality and race within transness as well. So she talks about what she calls the borderland analogy, specifically relating this to gender ideology. There's this perception most people have that being transgender is either transitioning from female to male or from male to female. That's it. There's no in between. Koyama combats this by talking about what she refers to as the borderland, a space that's not necessarily alternating between male and female, but its own idea entirely, and outside of conventionality. This is better outlined in the following quote from the feminism article, which okay. I'll also read it, but the borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is in a constant state of transition. The prohibited and forbidden are its inhabitants. This was later clarified in a talk given by one of the other scholars we studied in class, and were fortunate enough to have as a guest speaker, Susan Stryker. Essentially, she views being transgender not as crossing some sort of imaginary line or border, as many cis people tend to see it. She also addressed the inherent whiteness that exists in queer studies and put what I'd seen in my high school GSA, and even in my parents' words, into something much more substantial. This notion that the very concept of what it means to be transgender is defined based on Eurocentric ideals of what sex and gender mean, and that these ideals have been forced onto communities of color because of colonialism. This aligned with what I'd researched on, what I'd learned about Hinduism as well. But what was most important was the fact that all of these definitions were arbitrary and made up. What being transgender is here is completely different from what it is even in other Western nations like Europe, and completely different from what it is in Asia. But the one thing that they all had in common is they all described gender without the nuance of a borderland analogy or something similar. Instead, they've been boiled down in such a way that would be easier for cisgender people to understand. In Susan Stryker's words, what being transgender actually is, without all of these constraints of conformity, is it's not an either-or situation, but rather both and. Reflecting on this in terms of my own intersectionality sparked a realization that it's not that my identities clash, but instead that they occupy a space that is naturally and rightfully theirs, which was brought to light from another quote from Emi Koyama's article, which is up there again, but again, I will be reading it. The borderland analogy is not meant to suggest that transsexual people are somewhere between male and female. Rather, the space that they occupy is naturally and rightfully theirs, and I am merely calling attention to the unnaturalness of a boundary that was designed to keep them out. This reading, while not necessarily focus on intersectionality as I've outlined it today, helped me realize that I don't have to fully assimilate to the norm like I thought. Deviating from the expectations of others doesn't make me inconsistent, and I don't have to sacrifice parts of my identity to force myself to fit into groups. In actuality, there's no such thing as Indian Noor as opposed to non-binary Noor. The notion of having been whitewashed or sacrificing my ethnicity in order to feel more like myself is rooted in colonialism, and the kind of limited worldview that I saw in Flemington and convinced myself was the standard was far from reality. Though the task of carving out a place for myself, all aspects of myself, may seem like it's daunting, I know now that it's not something I'll have to do alone, as I initially thought. There is no such thing as gay enough, or trans enough, or desi enough, or even Asian enough, and being too much of one does not make me any less of another. Instead, it makes me the most authentic version of myself, however I may present and however I may be perceived by others. Thank you.